Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya and welcome to another episode of TFiR Let's Talk here at KubeCon and CloudNativeCon in Valencia, Spain. And today we have with us Anish Dhar, co-founder and CEO of Cortex. Anish, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, we are doing in person. We are at the event. I'm pretty sure that you have been to keynotes, you have seen the booths, you sponsored, met a lot. What kind of energy you have seen?
Oh, it's been amazing. I think being in person, it's just a different energy level altogether. I think my favorite part from yesterday was seeing customers that we had never met across the world come up to our booth and just say hi. I think it's really, you can really feel the energy from everyone just meeting different companies and kind of getting back together in person. This is my first KubeCon, and so I think I'm pretty lucky that it's in person and that I get to see people face to face, which I think is really exciting.
Because if I'm not wrong, the company was created during the pandemic, right? So there was no in-person interaction either way. So let's talk about the company. You are a co-founder. Tell us, why you created the company, what problem you saw that you wanted to solve, and also you started the company in kind of rough times, So you decided, no, this is the right time to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was previously at Uber, and Uber is like the classic case of microservices gone wrong. I think on my team itself, there were 500 services and over 5,000 at the company. And it became really difficult to understand which teams owned which services and whether those services were following best practices in things like production readiness and security standards. And I remember we would track a lot of this data in spreadsheets, which would always go out of date when you needed them. And engineers love naming services after TV shows and all sorts of crazy things. And so when there was incidents, it was really difficult to triage and find the appropriate owner. And oftentimes the engineers who wrote the most critical services would leave the company. And so they take that tribal knowledge with them. And I think what we saw is that it hurts developer productivity in a lot of different ways, from new engineer onboarding, because it becomes difficult to understand, hey, what's being built and what are the downstream dependencies on the services that I'm working with, to on-call response, to even just building new services. There was so much duplication of work across the company because people didn't really have a good understanding of what was going on. And I was talking with two close friends of mine. One was an engineer at Twilio and the other at a smaller startup called LendUp. And we came from three very different sizes of companies, but everyone had the same issues around understanding services and tracking their quality. And so we started Cortex. We went through the Winter 20 Y Combinator batch. And then coming out of that, raised our seed from Sequoia. And most recently just raised our A, co-led by them in Tiger Global. And so it's been super exciting. I think being remote, we were remote first, just like you said, because of the pandemic, but I think it's been an amazing journey so far, and I think we've grown the team a ton too.
What kind of adoption have you seen of, also as you said, this is the first time you met a lot of customers or clients. But when I talk about adoption, I'm not talking about necessarily numbers, but kind of use cases.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think if you look across our customer base, we have companies across multiple different industries, but the common theme is these customers care a lot about reliability and security. So most recently, we started working with Roblox, who bought Cortex really to help, one, give them understanding of what are all the services that are being built in the company, but two, ensure that even 1% of downtime for them results in millions and millions of dollars in losses. And so I think Cortex was really brought to help enforce those best practices in reliability and security and give engineers good visibility into what does actually a good quality service look like, which I think often lives in people's heads. But we even have customers like StockX who, we have this product called scorecards where you can basically grade the quality of your services across all your tooling and infrastructure. And StockX basically has this workflow where they'll make an API call to our scorecards product, and if you're not meeting 80% on your production readiness scorecard, you can't even deploy your service. And so I think there's some really interesting use cases that we've started to see with Cortex, and but the real common theme is like we need to create that culture of reliability and ownership.
You used a couple of words. You talked about culture. You also talked about, a scorecard. I want to break it down. First of all, if you can talk about, if you look at Cortex, are you a service company or a product company? Where does it run? Talk about, what does your service or product look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So Cortex, basically it's a platform for engineering teams to understand and improve their services. And so we have both cloud and self-hosted versions of the product. Oftentimes for like security-focused companies or financial companies, they run the on-prem version, which is a Helm chart you can just deploy in any Kubernetes cluster. We built the product on GCP, and I think we are lucky that we have a pretty sizable engineering team now who continues to improve the product. And we have the core of it is a service catalog. So it catalogs your services and builds that single pane of glass to understand everything from what's on call, who's on call for the service, to where's the documentation for it, to where the Datadog SLOs. And then you can actually do interesting things with that data once inside Cortex. You can basically grade its quality using scorecards. And then we also have a scaffolder product that lets you create services directly from Cortex. And so you can templatize, for example, Spring Boot services, and engineers just fill out a form and Cortex will create the service end to end, like from creating the Git repo to running the templating engine to scaffolding the code. So it's a great way to make sure services are being, standards are being met from day one.
Excellent. And second part is also, I want to understand the cultural part.
Yeah.
The cultural part is, of course, it's all about culture, right? You talk about reliability. And then we used, in early days, we used to have silos, right? And the whole idea of cloud native or DevOps movement was to break those old silos. Yeah. But when we look today, we are kind of creating new silos. It depends on, somebody will call it federated, but they are still silos. It's based on the area of expertise you have.
Absolutely.
But in the end, you're trying to solve one basic problem for a business, which is to keep running the business, to keep adding new services. Everything else is secondary. So if I look at just purely from Cortex point of view, what kind of cultural shift you have seen? Yeah. Or second is how you're becoming a catalyst to enable that cultural shift?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think microservices force teams into silos, and teams have context on what they're building, but they don't have context on what other people are building across the company. And what we've seen is, take a 100% engineering team. That's around the first time you'll hire an SRE or spin up a team focused on reliability. And the goal of that team is let's make sure our services are reliable and that people are following best practices. What that ends up happening is these teams create these crazy spreadsheets tracking all of the services. I've seen like 500 rows, 15 columns. Each column is a different tool, and ownership is very difficult to understand because these SREs aren't the ones building the services, but they still are now tasked with this like almost impossible thing to make sure everyone's services are reliable. And you ping engineers over Slack, telling them that their service sucks. And it creates this emotional tension between SRE, product engineering, security, who has the same emotional pain, and then technical leadership sits on top of all of that and is asking questions like, where are the areas of risk in my business? And so all of that, I think, gets exponentially worse as the company grows. And I think it really impacts the culture of your engineering organization. And so I think that's really the value prop of Cortex is let's build a place where all these different functional groups, we can bridge the gap between them and have one centralized place where you can understand exactly what's being built, who's building it, and the quality of that software, which is really why we call Cortex a system of record for engineering. IT had ServiceNow, sales has Salesforce, but engineering has never had a system of record to do exactly that, to kind of bridge the gap between all these functional groups, which is now just the way you build an engineering organization is people start specializing. And so I think it's been really interesting to see how companies adopt that model. And that's why I think companies that have been working with us now close to a year, you start seeing really interesting shift happen where now engineers actually care about the quality of their services. I mean, they always cared, but they didn't always have that visibility. And I think Cortex creates this like almost gamification of service quality, bridging that gap, and really lifting this burden off SREs and security engineers especially.
And one more thing you mentioned earlier was tribal knowledge with teams. And then, of course, which also leads to kind of technical debt, and then knowledge get logged. How does you help teams to kind of mitigate or eliminate? I mean, tribal knowledge is something which is hard, but also technical debt that you incur because you're doing so much within one team. So can you talk about, first of all, how important or critical that is for success for a company, and how do you help mitigate that?
I think it's one of the most important things that often gets overlooked is technical debt. I mean, we think about it all the time when we're thinking about shipping new features, right? There's that balance between how fast do you ship versus how much technical debt you take on. And I think technical debt is one of those things that it can get, you don't have to think about it until it's too late, right? And I think we've seen that story play out like myself and my co-founders in our previous companies. And I think it's something that I think Cortex really helps with. And one of the scorecards people often create are things tracking technical debt. And that could be something as simple as like code coverage, right? Like you want to make sure all your code that you're shipping has maybe over 90% test coverage. And so that's something you can actually track with Cortex and get reports that break down it by service, by team, by product, by business line. And so now suddenly leadership can get good visibility into, hey, these, X teams are doing well, these other teams need additional resources. I think you can make really educated decisions where before it's like, I had to go and, basically ask every single engineer or go and look at GitHub myself or look at SonarQube. It's not as easy to kind of get those aggregated reports, which I think Cortex helps with.
Excellent. One more thing before we wrap this up is also, of course, you have solutions, but most of these things, as we talked about, is also cultural and process-based. Yeah. So, of course, I'm not asking you to share a playbook, but what are the things you would advise that teams should follow to ensure that at least they can take care of some of these problems that we just talked about?
Yeah, I think it comes down to communication, and it sounds simple, but I think a lot of teams sometimes under-communicate, and especially in a world where everyone is remote, I think you start seeing documentation scattered across 6 or 7 different places, right? Like Google Docs, Confluence, your Notes app, your Head. Like, I think information becomes siloed in all these different places, and then when engineers go out to build new services, they don't have full context on even what the service they're using is, or what are the dependencies of that service. And so I think that impacts the quality of that software, but then also makes it hard. Like if that service goes down, who do I talk to? Where's the documentation for it? Things like that. And so I would say that I think building a healthy culture of over-communicating, have a really good process around where to document things, and then just do a lot of retros, thinking like, hey, the things that we shipped, are they actually meeting the quality standards for our team? I think all of those things would really help.
So we are, almost in the middle of 2021. No, it's 2022, right? It's hard to say which year we are in, but I think we'll get used to it. But in the middle of it, so company is relatively new. But can you also share not exactly your roadmap, but what are the things in the pipeline? What are the things you're working on? What are the problems that you're looking to solve in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the interesting things we found about Cortex is that we started the company to help engineering teams with microservices, but people put everything in Cortex. They put resources, databases, S3 buckets, libraries, pipelines. At the end of the day, all of these things are pieces of your software that have their own owner and come with their own set of tribal knowledge. And so one of the things that we're going to be supporting in Cortex soon is this concept of a resource catalog, where you'll be able to connect your AWS account, for example, and will automatically ingest and pull in and link services with S3 buckets or resources in AWS, and then actually be able to visualize that in your dependency graph, and maybe even layer cost insights on top of that. So you'll be able to see, hey, this pool of services and all of the infrastructure around it is costing me X dollars per month, and then reporting that by team, product, business. So I think it's going to give incredible insight to engineers about the services that they're consuming, what's the infrastructure look like, and then I think give businesses a really good insight into what are things actually costing.
Anish, thank you so much for taking time out today, and of course talk to me about the company. It's good to hear the story as well, and also the larger problem that you folks are solving. And as usual, I would love to have you back on the show in person or remotely. So I'm looking forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.